Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be showing some tips for weathering a tank. So for 20mm wargaming, I was always a huge fan of the Armor Fast kits. And unfortunately, they're no longer in business, but if you can pick these up, they're just great kits to have. I mean, they came with 2 tanks per kit. And frankly, the detail was good enough. I mean, it's a little sparse, but they're easy little kits to assemble. I mean, they're made for wargaming and they were just perfect for it. I think that Plastic Soldier Company has pretty much taken over the mantle now for 20mm armor kits, but if you can get them, they're a great buy. So I've got a M4 tank here that I'm going to work on, and I pretty much airbrush that up with uniform green. It gives a pretty good look from that. And looking at it, you can throw it on the tabletop, it's there. It's just sort of blah. So you want to add a little bit more to that. I'm going to talk about using some of the Tamiya weathering kits. But before I do any of that, I'm actually going to be using a sepia ink wash. And I've talked about this before in my miniature painting tutorials using washes. One thing you want to use with this is wet water, which is basically just water with a tiny amount of dish soap added to it. It's just a little bit of a surfactant there. And you're going to give a nice even coat over pretty much the whole surface of the model and just allow that ink to get into those cracks and crevices. And you can see here, let's say with this 50 caliber machine gun, adding a little bit of that wash to that just brings out that detail. Now you're going to get some pooling, and a trick of getting all that excess off is to put your brush onto a paper towel and then go back to the areas that pooled it up, and it'll just draw that up right into the brush. You can see here that I'm just pretty much putting it on the paper towel, getting the excess off, and then you can go back to the model. We have these areas here and just draw that brush along there, and it'll just, through capillary action, get sucked up into that brush. And so, after it sits for a while, and you can see some areas that build up maybe too much ink. It's a little too dark there. That's just an easy way to get that excess off. You can see up at the top there, just drawing that up, it's all that excess off and imparts a really nice look and brings out that detail into that model. I'm going to touch up the hatch a little bit more. And you're going to see now for the rest of the tank, I'm going to go through that. I'm going to show that into the next part of this clip here. And you can see now I've added that sepia ink onto that. And you can see the air intake and the grill back there, that all that detail sort of brings out along the treads and such, especially you can see on the hatches there for the tank. Just having that sepia ink just brings out that detail. It's a good way of working with it. And frankly, it's probably just good enough. I think it adds a fair amount of detail. It's a very easy thing to do. And I think if you just use a good wash, sometimes this is perfect for the tabletop. I'm going to add a little bit more to this tank by using these Tamiya weathering kits. And this is sort of interesting stuff because frankly, what it is just basically pigment that adheres to this material that will stick to the model. And honestly, it's the best way to think about it, mascara for tanks. You even get this little applicator tip with it. It's like a brush and it's got like a sponge. You can use makeup sponges. They're really good for applying to this. I'm going to be using a little bit of foam, but I'm going to add a little bit of dusting to the surface of the model there. So I'm going to use an old filbert brush that I have, and it's just been pretty much worn on down. You're going to pretty much directly stick that into the pigment and just brush it onto the tank. And what I try to do here is just define the upper surfaces. And I think that's areas that would probably build up dust and gunk and dirt. And I'm going to just give it a nice brush and covering that over there. Now, this dust material has the pigment stuck to these little particles, and it's sticky, so it will adhere to the tank. And some of that will flake off and dust off. You can sort of see that a little bit, a little puff of dust that goes through there. You're just going to go ahead and go through the surface of this and pretty much cover all the areas I think that would capture a lot of that dirt and grime. Pretty much usually from the top down, I'm working a lot of the edges. But also even over the flat surface of that'll impart some pigment to this. And this is a little slow, it's a little tedious, but I think that you will get a wonderful effect using this weathering kits. So I'm pretty much going to go through the whole model on the top here. You can look through on the turret ring, and especially on the air intake on the back of that and the air filter. I'm just going to go ahead and get all of that covered with this weathering material. And it just takes a while, but just work through it, go through the surface. And you can see here on the turret, that's got, I think, a lovely look there for the dust to it. You can look on the tank too. You can see how it just sort of builds up. And again, if you get too much on there, you can wipe off the excess with your finger, maybe a little bit of water. Now I'm going to give the treads a little bit more love. And here I'm going to be using mud. I'm going to show this now, a different way of applying to this. Now, in this case here, I'm using a small bit of foam from, say, a foam packaging and utilizing that. Or you can use like an applicator. Makeup brushes are great for this too. For that, I'm going to stick it directly into the pigment, and then I'm just going to brush it onto the tank. And I'm going to add, because this is mud and stuff and mud and dirt, it's going to be pretty copious amount that I'm going to throw on there. And so you're just going to use quite a bit of applications for that. And the idea is just to go through as much of the treads as possible in the wheels. All the areas you think that you're going to get a lot of dirt and grime in there, that's what you're going to do. And so I'm just going to use this to go along the edges of the track, along those wheels there, and the wheel wells and the front spokes, and just work my way through that. And this is a pretty easy little thing to do, but it will add, I think, add a fair amount of life and detail to the tank. You can see here on the front tread, I'm just going to work on that. And you can just see now how that's just sort of putting that gunk over that tread and making that stand out as like a little bit more dirt and gunk. And it's a pretty easy little technique to do, and you can get some good coverage using this stuff. So you just slowly work that in there, and eventually you'll get, I think, the look that you want. So there you go. I think it looks pretty good. It has like a little bit more of that dust and gunk and grime on it. You can see on the treads there, and of course on the top, like a lot of that dust and grime and build up. Frankly, again, just using a wash or sepia ink would work, but just adding this gives it a little bit more life on that. It gives it a little bit more of a weathered look. Looks like it's just been through hell and back. So these are pretty easy little things to work with, using this sepia ink. Now, I want to say when using this type of stuff, this material, it can rub off. So you want to make sure that you give it a coat of varnish. So, definitely through handling, through war games and stuff like that with your hands and just the moisture on your fingers, you're going to rub that stuff off. So in order to keep that on there, you definitely want to give it a clear coat of varnish. But that's a tank. And, I have it like the turn a little loose here so I can rotate that around. And I think it looks great. It looks really good. And as I mentioned, just adding a little bit of weathering to your paint job, this will give so much more life to the model. Looks great. Can't wait to get it on the tabletop.